Greetings, everyone. Welcome to our exclusive Global Leading Voices webinar campaign. We are delighted to have you join us here today. Please be informed that if you have any questions during the presentation, you may type them into the question box in your control panel. The presenter will answer your questions at the end of the presentation accordingly. Now, without further ado, we will turn the time over to our presenter, who will begin shortly.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to, I think, this exciting episode of, I think knowledge and information. PECB is really, we are happy to be on this and be invited by PECB to be on this webinar, where a lot of information will be shared, starting by ISO and 27001 and ISO 22301. So let me introduce myself quick, and my colleague also will introduce himself. So my name is Rudy Shushani. I'm strategist in governance of cybersecurity and digital transformation. I have 22 years experience in the field, and I've been really dedicating all of my recent 3-4 years now to public speaking in specific, to try to be and enhance the awareness about governance and governance of cybersecurity. So because I really believe that now everything with digital transformation that is happening in the world, cybersecurity is a key part to protect our lives. So with that, I'll leave it to Rod to introduce himself, and we will start accordingly.
Thank you, Rudy. And so I'm Rod Crowder. I'm in Sydney, Australia, and I'm the founder and CEO of an organization called OpsCentre. Our business specializes in resilience, risk management, disaster recovery, and business continuity planning. And yeah, similar to Rudy, I've 20+ years experience in business continuity, information security, and disaster recovery planning. We help organizations to assess risks, look at the business impacts, develop continuity strategies and plans, and then test and exercise them. And we have around 150 or so clients, and we've completed approximately 450 or so projects over our 20+ years. So excited to be here today, and yeah, look forward to sharing information with you, with Rudy, for the next hour or so.
Yeah, thank you, Rod, for that. So let's move on with our agenda today. All right. So as we mentioned in the opening, it's gonna be introduction, as we did now. We're gonna be talking about ISO 27001 Information Security Management System overview, ISO 22301 Business Continuity Management System, improving on ISO 27001 continuity plan with ISO 22301, and of course, what's must is to share our experiences and case studies and some of the implementation challenges that we have faced. So let's go into the first part, which is why ISO 27001 and what is ISMS. So ISO 27001 is an international standard for information security. It sets out to be for information security management system, which is the ISMS that we will be mentioning more and more as we speak. Then ISO 27001 helps organizations manage information security via manage information security via people, process, and technology. So it touches 3 points: the people, the process, and the technology. It's also a certification is needed to be recognized worldwide, and it is certified and recognized internationally. So originally published by International Organizations for Standards, ISO, as ISO 27001, and of course there was a series 27002 and 3, but today the certification is only on the 27001. So the goal of the 27001 certification is the effective establishment of management of ISMS, Information Security Management System. An ISMS is a holistic management approach to securing the confidentiality, the integrity, and the availability of corporate information assets, CIA. That's the main target. Also, it consists of policies, procedures, and other controls involving people, process, and technologies, as we mentioned. You may use this ISO guide as a framework to develop and implement your best cybersecurity practices. It's built on 14 domains and 114 controls. So now let's mention what are the benefits, which is the most important part. What are the 4 key benefits? Of course, the most important part is protection of your organization. This is the most important part, especially in the last years where we've seen a lot of attacks, we've seen a lot of challenges, a lot of digitization and digital transformation, and a lot of breaches, and of course, a lot of regulations. So what are really the benefits? The first one is compliance. This is the first benefit of ISO, which is, it might seem odd on the list, but to benefit, that is the main, or actually the biggest return on investment. And we know today with breaches and being non-compliant, what is the cost? If you look at GDPR, it's 4% of your total revenue, or 20 million, whichever is higher. So that is crazy numbers. That is why you need compliance. And compliance technically not just for the regulators, but also for other companies, so that you can make sure that you are giving them the assurance that you are certified. The second one, reduced expenses, that comes without say, where the expenses of having without implementing an ISMS is really much higher, because there's a lot of things that are discoveries, are being tested, are not based on best practices, and so on. So there's no really ISMS, and this is where it comes in, and there's no streamlined process and procedures that can help. So here definitely it can reduce expenses, and also of course on the fines that you will possibly get because you are compliant. The third one, which is marketing edge. Sometimes you come and ask, why are we talking about marketing? Something not related to ISO. Well, it is related to ISO in this case, because for some of the service providers, this is a very good marketing tool. Or if you have any service, or you're offering any service, was it to your clients, was it your B2B or your B2C, once you are ISO certified or you have the ISO certification, it becomes a big tool for you to sell your services. Last one, to place your organization in order, and this is very important with ISMS. Once you streamline your processes, your procedures, and everything, it can guide you of how to do that and place them in order, so that you're not working on something that is not being proven, or something arbitrary or without any knowledge. It's actually have a background, and it's a framework where you can jump on it. So now we're talking about ISMS. So what is really ISMS? If you look at the elements of ISMS, it talks about information security policies, organization of information security, the human resources, assets control, cryptographic physical environment, operation security, communication security, system acquisitions and development and maintenance, supplier relationship, information security, incident management, and I think this is very important. Of course, information security aspects of business continuity. This is what we're going to be talking with Rob more as we speak in the second part of this webinar. And of course, the compliance part. So it consists of 14 controls, as we mentioned, 34 control objective, and 114 control points. This is about to change. We'll see it in few slides with ISO 27001 version 2022, which is now being released. It's still not being released, but it will be released within the coming months. But we have a very advanced draft, so we can actually work on. So with that, how do we really implement the ISMS? What is the main keys? So it touches information assets, hardware assets, the people, the building, the software assets. All of these are really key elements. And most importantly, also, it works on plan, do, act, and check base, which we will see more information about it. And this is a very common thing, I think, with ISO, that they follow that methodology of implementation. Yeah. So let's understand a little bit more. What are those 14 controls that we mentioned earlier on, and what is inside each and every one? So we start with information security policies. Its management needs to provide direction and support for information security in accordance to business requirements and relevant laws and regulations. So in essence, your information security teams need to create information security policies, and this is where it comes and helps. And the documents define how your organization will set up your ISMS. It should really contain a set of policies for management to communicate with employees and extra parties. Don't forget your suppliers, and most importantly, your customers. So if you go to the second one, which is organization of information, now we know more about information security policies that are key of this ISMS and ISO certification. Organization of information technology, it's about setting up a management framework to initiate control on, of the operation of information security within our organization. Your organization should think about roles and responsibilities. Who is the CISO? Who does what? Do you have a monitoring system? Who is involved? What's the role of the governance? What's the role of the board? Who is segregation? Do you have segregation of duties? You need to define all of those in that aspect. Then we move to the third control, which is human resource security. This is where it's defined under A7. It's divided into two different stages. It's before, during, and termination or change of employments, because we really need to be aware about our employees and our human resources. And then we go to the asset management, where you need to comply to create an inventory of all of your assets, no matter where it is, what it is. Was it wireless, physical, firewalls, software, you name it, you need to do the asset management so that you can actually track and know. And this is a big pitfall for companies. They don't know their assets. And then we jump into now from asset management to asset control. And this is where the control handles the control to the systems, documents, software for users. Your organization will need to write an access control policy. Do you have an access control policy? How to manage users, how to create users, how to manage registration, how to review them, how to audit them, how to adjust. So all of this happens in the ISO 27000 access control. Cryptography. We have two controls in here. First control is about cryptographic controls are needed to ensure the protection of the confidentiality, authenticity, and the integrity of the information. Very important. Make sure that you think about the available, mature, and advanced encryption solutions. Sorry for that. Something happened. Rod, can you see my slides? Okay, so we move on to our, I cannot see my slides. All right, so we move on beyond to A11, which is physical and environmental security. And this is where the goal of implementing those controls to prevent unauthorized changes and interference of information and facility management, such as the building, the IT infrastructure, the access, and so on and so on. Also, on the control number 12, we move on to operation security. There's 14 controls in here. These operation controls covers the securing of all operational matters of the process within the scope of ISMS, from documentation to procedures and event logging and so on, because with operations, you're actually touching every point of your systems. Point 14, or control number 14, which is system acquisition and development. Sorry, I missed A13, which is communication and security. Here, we're talking about the high-level topology of the network, added value, because you need to understand how your network actually functions. You need to map it, you need to dive into it and understand where's your firewalls and so on. So you need to do all of this. What are your access points, your virtual LANs? So it's a full network architecture and data flow. On point number A14, which is system acquisitions and development, which aims to build the security to infrastructure of information systems that includes requirement analysis and design, testing, and implementation. On the supplier information or relationship, we always miss, if we follow traditionally, we always miss our suppliers. And the biggest hack that happened last year was with solar wind, was because of supplier relationship. And here there are 5 controls on the supplier information you must address within your supplier agreements. You must make them part of your agreements. You must make them part of your your security practice. And for regulatory monitoring, for access, for assessing their network, assessing their work, and assessing their ISO certification, of course, part of your ISO certification. And we jump to control number 16, which is information security incident management. And this is where everything we talk about, how we're gonna be reporting the events, the weaknesses, the objective, and how is the reporting happening, what should we report, what should we say, what should we do, what should we file, what procedure to allow, and so on and so on. And then next we jump to the common, there's a lot of common parts, but this is the major common part between ISO 27001 and 22301, which Rod will speak more, is the information aspect of business continuity. And here we need to more dive into the business continuity aspect. And this is where the ISO will complement this by going full-fledged into the business continuity. And lastly, the compliance. And here we're talking about the organization, how to avoid breaches, how to avoid the legal and statutory, regulatory, and contractual obligation, was it internally or externally, so that you don't have a problem with your regulators. Now that we know more about this, let's understand a little bit about the compliance steps. I'll go over them quickly. First one is the organization context. You need to understand the organization context, then the scope, then the leadership that will be involved, then you have to start planning, then organization context in terms of how things are being implemented, the operations, the performance, and most importantly, the improvement. It follows those 8 steps that are critical for you to be implementing the ISO 27001. So we mentioned the plan, do, act, plan, do, check, act methodology of implementation. This is where it is really built in within ISO as a core delivery method of implementation of this, and it goes with understanding the scope, stakeholders, strategic objectives. This is in the planning, risk, methodology, assets, threat vulnerability, and support. In the do, it's about the implementation, the risk treatment, the evidence, and operating the ISMS. Check is audit, logging, and management meetings review. And act, where you get the ownership of the management and fixing those non-conformities. It's really important to mention, as I mentioned before, that ISO is not alone. It has extra help that was created by ISO so that they can help you more. but the certification happened on ISO 27001, where ISO 27002 actually talks about more on the guidance, on the selection, on the implementation, management of those controls. So it's more of an extra guide that can help you towards how you're going to be implementing ISO 27001. Whereas on the 27002, it's a full-fledged information security management guideline for you to read and involve as much information that will give you a lot of guidance of implementation, design concept and inception planning, and so on and so on. So those three actually run all together as one, but the certification, again, as we mentioned, happens on the 27001. So what to expect in the 2022 changes so that you are updated and know more? It might, and how will it affect your ISO 27001? So far, in our opinion, the best way to comply to these is to update your risk treatment process, to update your statement of applicability, and adapt certain sections in your existing policies and procedures. The new changes are on threat intelligence, ICT readiness, configuration management, data masking, monitoring activities, securing code, information security cloud, because it didn't mention before, physical monitoring, information deletion, data leakage prevention, and web filtering. And we have to note it's going to be, instead of 114 controls, it's going to be some of the controls will be merged and reconstructed so that it is 93 controls. And this is where we say this is about ISO 27001, and I'll let my colleague continue to understand more about ISO 22301 on the business continuity management. Rod, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Rudy, for that great overview. That's hope I can do such a good job on business continuity as you've done with the overview of information security. So I'll take a similar sort of approach, a little bit of an overview of the business continuity management system, and then Rudy and I will talk a bit about where the differences and the alignment between the two standards are, and particularly where business continuity management can dovetail in and assist people implement 27001. So first of all, what is business continuity management? What is it? What does it mean? Fundamentally, it's about having a structured process in place to respond to any sort of significant incident or business disruption. What does that really mean in real terms? I guess imagine waking up one day and turning up the office or workplace to be in the office, or turning on the morning news and seeing that your normal workplace has been impacted by a major fire or flood. Power to the whole area has been turned off. Buildings are in darkness. There's no power. Telecommunication services are turned off. It's pretty chaotic, and people are arriving at office buildings and getting turned away by building security, told to go home. Public transport's affected, and so on. So I guess if you're faced with that sort of situation, as we see on the news every day, many organisations have been faced with exactly that. What would your organisation do to continue delivering its products and services? And that's really what having a business continuity plan is all about, having a structured response to minimize the impact to your organization. And as part of that, you'd have identified things like your critical business functions and processes, what business continuity roles need to be in place, what critical resources you might require, so people, equipment, locations, systems, information, data, third-party services. What are your critical customers and what are their service agreements? And if you have to prioritize work because you don't have the full resources, then how do you prioritize? How do you communicate? And so on. So really, BCM is all about basically having that structured response in place. Thanks, Rudy. Next slide. Sorry, I'm going to have to ask Rudy each time for the next slide.
Is that okay?
Rudy? Can you, no, next slide, please. Oh, thank you. You missed one. You skipped one.
I skipped one, yeah. There we go.
No, back another one, please. Back one more.
That's it.
Okay, so all right, that's fine, no problem. So look, oh no, we've gone back again. Can you, thank you, that's the one. So in terms of that business continuity framework I talked about, how would you go about developing and implementing such a framework? I guess there are lots of ways. You could just use your own intuition. You could use Dr. Google, and you could go and Google for business continuity plan or business continuity process. You could use a professional practice from the likes of Disaster Recovery Institute. They have 10 professional practices which outline a system for implementing business continuity. You could use industry standard regulations. A lot of organizations in banking and finance and healthcare and so on particularly have well-established regulatory requirements around what they expect to see as part of business continuity. But if you want to use a internationally recognized standard, then obviously ISO 22301 is the standard to use. It basically maps out the whole approach, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. It maps out the whole approach to planning, implementing, operating, maintaining, and continually improving your overall business continuity management system. And very similarly to 27001 that Rudy talked about, there are some really good benefits to using a structure such as 22301. I mean, first of all, to have any sort of business continuity management system in place, I mean, it's just good business practice. It makes good business sense to actually know that you have established a business continuity management system, and you know what your risks are, what the potential impacts are, and what to do if you experience some sort of an incident. The second key benefit is really that you can maintain compliance. So similar to 27001, as Rudy mentioned, you can maintain compliance with regulations, and obviously make sure that your customers or your supply chain and so on are also protected. So people that you're dealing with are also protected in the same way. It's actually also a marketing advantage to have a business continuity management framework in place. We've seen a lot of organizations these days when they're responding to tender documents and bidding for work and so on, that some of the target companies will actually ask, do you have business continuity in place? Has it been tested? Has it been maintained and so on? So it's effectively a competitive advantage over some of your competitors if you have a business continuity management process in place and they don't, for example. And finally, obviously allows you to protect your organization, and particularly brand and reputation are very big aspects of business continuity management. You see a lot of organizations which that go through global crises and incidents and so on, and it's quite clear that they basically don't have any sort of structured system in place. They come out, they sort of make assumptions and say things that they shouldn't say, and so maintaining your customers, maintaining cash flow, protecting your brand and reputation are very important. And next slide, please, Rudy. Thank you. So just in terms of how we go about business continuity planning, most VCPs are built on resource impacts rather than specific incident scenarios. And what that really means is we don't really care so much about what has happened, even though there are all these different types of events like fires and floods and denial of access that can impact your premises, and there's pandemics and epidemics and transport issues that can impact people, and there's loss of data centers and networks and communications and information that can impact your IT systems. We don't really care so much about those, but really more about what are the impacts on our resources that we normally use to deliver our services. So let's say you're a manufacturing company and there's normally 1,000 people that come to work every day. You've got 5 sites, you've got 100 different pieces of machinery and 50 different IT applications which manage all the production schedules and so on. And let's say that 1 or 2 of your premises gets impacted by a flood, or that there's a new wave of the global pandemic and 50% of your staff are impacted, or that your core ERP system, which tracks all of your inventory and all of your work processes, gets impacted. That's what we're really concerned about. We're really concerned about, sorry, Rudy, we've gone to another slide. We're really concerned about, what are the resources that have been impacted, and what is it we need to do about them? How do we actually maintain our normal business functions and processes, in spite of losing some of those different resources. Next slide, please, Rudy. And another. Thank you. So in terms of ISO 22301 structure, the business continuity management system, it is very similar to 27001 in a lot of ways. So there are quite a few overlaps. So there's what we call the context of the organization, leadership, planning, support, operations, performance evaluation, and improvement. And they are all the core elements which are consistent across 27001 and 22301. So if you're setting out on a journey to develop both, there's a lot of commonality that you can gain benefit from in terms of looking at, context of the organization talks about, what is the context in which we need to implement these different processes, information security, business continuity. So there might be some common elements there. Leadership, who's going to lead the project and so on, and who's going to manage it, and how we're going to come up with consistent planning methodologies and so on. So there are some very discrete areas where there's consistency across both of those two standards. But I guess one of the key things where the main difference applies is in 22301 is in section 8, where business continuity content is quite different to ISO 27001. And that's really around the specifics of around, how we undertake a business impact analysis, how we develop business continuity strategies, how we implement the procedures and the plans, and how we test and exercise them. And these are things that aren't actually described in 27001. So the benefit of putting 22301 and 27001, which we'll talk about in more detail in a moment, this is where it really comes into its own. And fundamentally, what we need to do as part of this whole process is, define, what are the organization's activities, its functions, its services, its products, its supply chain, its relationships, what are the stakeholder needs, what's the scope of both, whether it's 22301 or also 27001, what's the scope of the implementation, who's going to lead it, what are our policies and objectives, what kind of funding might we need, and so on. So there's a lot of areas across both of these two disciplines that we can actually implement sort of once to achieve both outcomes. So whilst 27001 does say that we need to have information security continuity, it doesn't tell you how to go about that. And I guess if there's one takeaway from today's webinar, I think it's that if you don't have that mechanism, how do you go about doing it? And 22301 helps you to define that. So I'll talk a little bit more about some of those requirements of 27001 and what it says around information security continuity, and then we'll go into some details around that as well. Next slide, Rudy. So if we put them side by side, there's a comparison chart here of 27001 and 22301. As I mentioned previously, there are a lot of very, very common areas. Sections 0 to 1 to 3 are an introduction, and both are very similar. The context of the organization, section 4 in both standards, is basically the same. The leadership aspects are both the same. Planning in terms of actions to address risks and assess risks, and are very similar. Support in terms of resources and competencies and awareness and communication are very similar across both. But as I mentioned last in operations is where things start to differ a little bit, and then we go back to performance evaluation and improvement. So there are definitely some quite common areas across the two standards. The one big difference with 27001, as Rudy went through, is that in Annex A of 27001, it's quite different to the business continuity standard, excuse me, because it defines all of the control objectives. So there's 34 control objectives and 114 individual controls which need to be considered for implementation. So in 27001, it maps out what all of those information security controls, which Rudy took you through. Business continuity management doesn't have such a similar list of controls, so that's quite different. Excuse me. Both of the standards are talking about availability, but again, 27001 is looking at CIA, confidentiality, integrity, and availability of information. They both leverage what's called the Plan, Do, Check, Act cycle. So they both use a very similar implementation methods, and then obviously they're both elements of an overall or overarching risk management strategy. Slightly different objectives, but the goals are basically the same. Next slide, please, Rudy. So what are the key differences between the two standards? Before we get into how they're complementary, 27001 is predominantly focusing on preserving the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of information, whereas business continuity 22301 is focusing on recovery and restoration of critical business and functions and processes after a disaster or an incident. So one is really about technology and information, and BCP, business continuity, is really about business-wide focus. So it's broader in its overall approach, because it's looking at people impacts, technology impacts, premises impacts, and third parties, whereas 27001 is really focusing on technology and information. Now, the next one is a little bit of a generalization, but fundamentally, ISO 27001 is more heavily focused, and I hope Rudy agrees with me, on the protection and pre-incident stage. So what I mean by that is, what are the protection mechanisms we need to put in place, and what are the controls we need to implement, and hence the lengthy list of controls in 27001, as opposed to BCP is more of an incident has occurred, what do we need to do to maintain business continuity? What are the steps and procedures? So in many ways, I see 27001 as sort of more focused on pre-incident, and 22301 focused on post-incident. Both have that underlying common management system. Next slide, please, Rudy. So I'd just like now to go through, excuse me, improving an ISO 27001 continuity deployment or plan using 22301. And I guess this is where the rubber hits the road in terms of, how do we actually use 22301 to support 27001? There's probably a few steps on this slide, Rudy. You might just want to click through. So in terms of what does ISO say, 27001 say about information security continuity? So the first domain, A1711, talks about determining requirements for information security and the continuity of information security management. It doesn't tell us how to do that. So it says we should determine the requirements, and we need to work out how we're going to maintain continuity of information, but it does not tell us what to do. But luckily or fortunately, 22301 provides exactly that. It advises us how to do a business impact assessment, how to develop business continuity strategies, and how to establish our resource requirements. Similarly, domain A17 or control A1712 under ISO 27001 says that we need to establish, document, and maintain processes and procedures, i.e. plans, for continuity of information security during an adverse situation. And 22301 gives us the guidance around establishing BC procedures, establishing an incident response structure, and establishing business continuity plans. And then finally, ISO 27001 says that we need to verify that those information security controls are effective and valid. And 22301 gives us the guidance around exercising and testing, performance and evaluation, and improvement. So these are really the key areas where the ISO 27001 requires us to do something, but isn't prescriptive. It doesn't actually tell us how to go about it. And this is basically then how we actually are able to go about it. So just looking at determining requirements. ISO 22301 has three key elements that relate to 27001 in terms of the BIA, the BC strategies, and the continuity resources. So when we do a business impact assessment, we look at what are the key activities of the organisation, what's their time criticality, what are peak periods, etc. We look at the key resources, so we include information, records, IT systems, applications, supply chain, etc. So what are the resources we need to deliver those key services? What are the interdependencies, and how might those interdependencies be impacted if there's a disruption? What are the potential impacts? So we look at things like financial impact, customer impact, legal, reputation, compliance, staffing. And then also we look at, obviously, at risks in terms of, what are our actual disruption related risks that might need to be treated. So if we think about that in terms of information security continuity, we can basically apply that business impact methodology around our information security framework to ensure that we've assessed what are the key activities in information security, we know what the resources are, we know what the dependencies are, we know what the impacts are if our information security resources are impacted, and we know what the risks are.
That's
moving on to the
beauty of
next
this,
session. Yes, Rudy.
Yeah.
Yeah, yes, exactly, Rudy. This is where they glue together, yeah? In terms of, oh, sorry, back on slide. Haven't quite finished on that slide, Rudy.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Okay, there you go. Similarly, ISO 27001 needs us to determine requirements in terms of business continuity strategies. What are the different strategy options to protect our information security controls, procedures, and processes? And our business continuity framework 22301 shows us how to determine strategies to protect our organization and our information from incidents, and prioritize our resumption timeframes and look at all the different mechanisms. So if we have, one piece of technology, we need to have duplicate technology. And if we have a particular process or a particular resource, do we need to have another one of those to maintain continuity from a strategy perspective? And then finally, what BCP does in terms of returning requirements is it enables us to determine what the resources are. So again, from a BCP perspective, we normally look at things like, what are our people, what are our information, our data, our premises, our systems, information, applications that are required to maintain business continuity. We can apply exactly that same principle to our IT service continuity. So what are the resources needed to keep our information security infrastructure and processes and staffing up and running? Next slide, Rudy.
Here we go.
Thank you. A little bit slow coming through here. Nope. Yes, establish plans. Similarly, when ISO 27001 says that we should establish plans, excuse me, plans, processes, and procedures and controls, again, does not tell us how to go about doing that. 22301, the three domains are 8.4.1, 8.4.2, and 8.4.4. They basically enable us to establish procedures and processes. What are our communications requirements? What are our first steps? How do we respond to threats? How do we focus on, disruptive events and so on? What is our incident response structure in terms of identifying thresholds and activating business continuity? What are the individual processes and procedures we need to document? How do we communicate and so on? So all those usual things that would be as part of a incident response structure. And then actually end up with a business continuity plan itself. So what are the roles and responsibilities? What is the, what are our priorities overall in terms of responding to an information security event? What are our communication strategies? How do we stand down post-incident? So again, basically BCP, the 22301 business continuity management framework gives us these methods for assessing how to implement our 27001. Next slide, Rudy. Oh, not quite. And then finally, one more click, please, Rudy. Just bring up the little banner. Finally, again, 27001 asks us to verify controls. And obviously one of the most important aspects of both 27001 and 22301 is validating and verifying what you've implemented. So testing and exercising of IT disaster recovery plans, business continuity plans, making sure that we, develop scenarios to test, excuse me, test those, test and exercise the business continuity management framework to validate what those requirements we've defined are, whether they're valid, developing exercise outcomes reports, and then looking at, how we have our after action reports and how we follow up with continual improvement to make sure that we're continually improving on our 27001 or 22301 processes is very important. The 22301 also it gives us a guidance around how to undertake performance evaluation. So which elements need to be monitored and how we're going to monitor those, how often. Some things need monitoring real time, some things need to be reviewed on an annual basis, and how do we analyze the results. And then obviously, how do we make sure that we have continual improvement? One of the key things around things like 27001 and 22301 is they never sit still. Obviously, the cyber landscape continues to evolve. The bad guys out there continue to find ways of cracking different firewalls and different sort of intrusion detection systems and so on. So we're always in catch-up mode when we're developing things. So we need to be continually improving and revising our 27001 framework and how our 22301 framework then also plugs into that. So we need to look at things like non-conformities, what are the causes, what are the corrective actions and so on, and how do we basically put our overall continuous improvement into 27001. Next slide, Rudy.
Yeah, I think we are reaching the pitfalls, which I think this is the great part of our experiences, so we can share this and some of the implementation challenges. It came to my mind now, even though I think ISO 27001 with the supplement ISO 27002 and 27003 has a little bit more edge towards ISO 22301 because there's more documentation available, so it can help versus the 22301. I don't know if you agree with that, Rod.
Absolutely, 100%. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
And there's a new version of 27001 about to be released as well, which is going to take it even closer, right?
Yeah, definitely. So some of the challenges that we have faced and then we agreed upon, me and myself and Rod, while discussing, is first is the culture aspect of things in the company. How much is your culture subtle to change? Your management is also, are they aware? Are they willing to change? Is the culture cybersecurity ready or not? Now we're starting seeing more a call for CISOs on board, because today the board is missing those people of understanding. And of course, if you got breached, who is the first person to call? Actually, it's the CISO. So we need more, culture awareness and culture, newer culture, so that they can actually adapt to newer changes. And today, I think we're moving fast with all of the challenges. And there's another challenge, which is lack of cybersecurity skills in general. And this is where top management commitment is much needed, so that they can support. It's not a project, it's a continuous improvement or continual improvement in your organization. It's not a one-time thing, it's always happening. We're always challenged. You don't shut down your network at night, so you need to have the management on board, so that anything happens, they are aware, they take decisions quickly. And this is where we see one of the challenges is the decisions based. How is it structured? Is it governed well? Is governance of cybersecurity implemented or not? ISO 27000 is one of the main players of this governance, because it touches different points also towards it. Scope, effort, and time. I'll share one of the stories, and of course, Rod will share some his experience. I went into an organization. They wanted to start ISMS, or actually ISO 27001. And one of their major downfalls was in the scope. So first, they wanted to implement the whole of ISO 27001 in one shot, which is impossible. And then secondly, that once they, let's say, for example, they did their threat analysis and then vulnerability management, they have more than 30,000 open use cases of vulnerabilities in their environment. So they've done it over a couple of months and they didn't do it before. And now all of a sudden they have 30,000 open tickets in their vulnerability management system. So how do they prioritize? How do they, give their priority? They wanted to tackle everything, and this is a total failure. So this is where risk management comes in. What's the most critical assets you have? External part, more important than internal. What's open to the internet? How do they access the email, the APIs, the web-based services and everything? I think this is the first thing you have to tackle. And this is where ISMS really comes in to organize all of those into a better perspective. And then prioritize your scope and define your scope. And first, know your scope. This is another challenge by itself. So imagine, you want to tackle a needle in a hay, so you are lost, totally lost. Where do you start? You start by the most critical assets, and then you move on as you move. What is the highest risk in your organization, and then you move. And last one is also in the risk management and the treatment of how, or risk assessment and the treatment of how it is being done is also a challenge, because as I mentioned in my earlier example, if it's not done well, if the risk treatment or the assessment itself is not accurate, the treatment will also fail, because possibly you'll be focusing on non-critical assets in your environment versus the critical assets which are exposed, which are highly critical in terms of threat and vulnerabilities and so on. I'll let Rod continue on this, on those points, and other points, of course, and then we'll get back to the question and answers. Don't forget to put your question and answers in the question and answer box.
So I got a couple of pitfalls that, I mean, we could talk for hours on. We could have a whole session, I think, Rudy, just on pitfalls alone. But just a couple, and one is very much aligned with your example. Scope is very important, and that's really where something like 22301 and 27001 do help. They give you that context around, what's the organization's scope, what are its critical functions and processes, where do we need to focus first, and so on. And I think one of the reasons that these types of projects fail, in our experience, is that you don't demonstrate quick wins. For example, we've seen organizations that say we're going to do an end-to-end business impact assessment, and it's going to take 9 or 10 months. And in that time, the business has changed. Bits of it have been sold. Business units have been merged.
Agile mentality or agile deployment of projects. It has to be in the same way somehow.
Absolutely, absolutely. So it really needs to be, what we found to be more successful way is saying, well, let's start with, one business. The entire business continuity management system might look like this. But let's start with one business unit or one location or even one application or one function, and let's build BCP around that. Let's get some champions. Let's get some people on board. Let's demonstrate the quick wins, and then sort of use a much more agile sort of approach to the implementation rather than
one.
Sorry, yeah, exactly. That's right, really. And as I say, build some commitment, some demonstrate, value add, etc. The other key one with business continuity, and I guess also to an extent with 27001 information security, is the documentation is often seen as the be all and end all. The project's seen as being successful if it generates reams and reams of documentation. Now imagine if you arrive at the building and it's blazing on fire one morning, God forbid, but a situation, you're not going to want to, well, it does happen, and you're not going to want to wade through a 120-page document and try and find the flowchart on page 37 that says this is what we do when we respond to a building fire. You really need to have documentation which is fit for purpose. And what we typically see is organizations which develop documents which are way, way too complex. So what we try to focus on ourselves when we're developing business continuity, sort of aid memoirs or quick reference guides, short handbooks or A3 sort of flowcharts that are double-sided, people can sort of look at very quickly and get the key points, because basically we see a BCP as a tool for trained staff. And I think that's a really point. It's a tool that for people that have been trained, and the more important outcome of a BCP program is not just all of the paperwork, but it's actually building that muscle memory and getting people trained in the response mechanisms through training, through awareness, through simulation exercises. It's not about having reams and reams of documentation sitting on a shelf. It's about having people be able to respond to an incident and know what to do and have those quick reference guides. So a couple of key things there. I think, you know, organizational commitment and scope is correct, Rudy. I completely agree. And in terms of documentation format, definitely, you know, is very, very important to get the right type of documents for the right types of audiences.
That's where the tabletop exercise, I think it really focuses on this, and then it shows us some spotlights, early spotlights at least, until things happens. If you don't have a tabletop exercise, I totally suggest on top of your actual implementation test, not just, you know, tabletop and then this is where it ends. No, go beyond and then have the courage to actually switch maybe a full site, and this is where actually the details comes in. I found a lot of, you know, hidden surprises once you do the switch, where it was never documented or never thought of, or and you need to do it with that.
It's all very well to look at it on, I mean, an organization needs to build maturity, right? So the first time they see the plans, they've probably been developed in isolation. So they've been developed in, you know, by different business units at different times, and therefore, you know, they haven't been brought together. So one of the first things we typically do is, you know, walk people through as a group, very basic, just get the group of people together or their respective plans and walk them through. Then we do a desktop simulation exercise, and as you say, Rudy, then we build maturity and get to a point where we potentially maybe do a live exercise. Some of our clients are never got the courage to actually do a live exercise. Some will stop at a desktop simulation. But as you say, you need to build that sort of level of maturity and understanding about how the plans are structured and how they're to be used.
Yeah, great. So if we have any questions, you can reach us at myself, Rudy at dxtalks.com, and any social media at Rudy Shushani, and rod.crowder at OpsCentre.com. Also on social media, Rod Crowder.
Thank you.
Yes.
Rudy and Rod, thank you very much for delivering this very informative question. Okay, I'll just go ahead and ask some of the questions from the attendees. The first question is, practically, what is the difference between business resilience and business continuity plan?
Excuse me. I think the jury is still out in terms of what that encompasses. There seem to be, and that's not a cop-out answer. I think the definition of, you know, resilience, business resilience versus business continuity is quite a controversial one. What a lot of organizations are seeing as business resilience is encapsulating emergency management, cybersecurity, privacy management, business continuity, all those different disciplines, to sort of say it's complete, you know, an overarching umbrella, if you will, of resilience. But there are so many, the whole business continuity community and industry seems to have jumped on we're now talking about resilience, and there's still a lot of that. Sorry, Rudy?
It's a trendy word now.
It is, yeah. But typically I would see a BCP as, in my opinion, and what I've seen as sort of one of the most commonly used, you know, sort of definitions or differences, is that BCP is one pillar, and I'd say all those other pillars like emergency management, cyber management, information security, privacy management, and so on, are all other pillars which all help to basically build an overarching resilience framework for an organization.
Yeah, I just want to add one more point, which is, I think, in a simplistic way. Once you test a lot, once you disrupt yourself a lot, once you pass through previous experiences, I think resilience is part of your next maturity game, and then you become more resilient towards those, especially in business continuity aspect.
Okay, thank you, Rudy and Rod. Okay, the next question is, if a company desires to implement both ISO standards but want to start with one, which will you recommend and why?
I'll go, and we discussed this a couple of days ago, I think, and we agree on the answer, so it's good. They are two separate ISO standards. So if you implement one, do implement others. Of course, it's going to be trouble on the implementation side because of the time allocation and the resources and so on, even though sometimes maybe the resources are not the same. but they are totally different standards where some common things are together, but you can implement them both. For me, I would say if I have nothing and I want to start, I will start by both and build my organization slowly towards the ultimate, having both standards implemented. That I would say. Rod, if you have anything else also.
Yeah, I guess it comes down to a little bit of the focus and what type of organization you are. If you are an organization which processes a lot of data and information, and you collect a lot of personally identifiable information, confidential information, and so on, you may have more of a requirement to look at 27001 as opposed to looking at 22301 first. So again, if information protection is more of the focus for your organization, then 27001 may make sense as a start point. If you've got regulatory requirements or customer requirements that saying you must have BCM, then maybe 22301 actually makes more sense. And again, to Rudy's point, if you're in an ideal scenario, you can sort of run them in parallel, just depending on the type of organization you are. But I think it really comes down to where are your key risks and what type of organization are you, which would help sort of guide a little bit. But they really are focusing on quite different things. So fundamentally, you really need both. I think that's my answer.
Yeah, I totally agree on this. And again, this is where the risk management comes in, and then really define because every organization is really different. It's one slice that cuts all. So you really have to find your internal priorities, your internal risk management. Where do you want to prioritize? Do you need, maybe, let's say you want to implement business continuity, of course, but as a longer target, because maybe now at this point of time you don't have a disaster recovery site, so that will possibly take maybe a year or 2 years to be built, or maybe it's outsourced to the cloud, or maybe as a third party. So all of this comes into the play, but you can definitely implement them both in terms of, because they don't conflict with each other, they complement each other.
Okay, thank you very much, Rudy and Rod, for delivering this informative webinar, and all the audience that was here with us today. Just be informed that this session is recorded and it will be posted on our website and YouTube channel, along with the slides of the presentation. Thank you one more time.
Thank you all for attending. Thank you for having us on PCB on this amazing webinar, and thank you, Rod, for being also here supporting and
Thank you.
Thank you, Rudy. Excellent. Thank you, everybody.